Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Jessica Balanzategui. I am a senior lecturer in cinema and screen studies at Swinburne University of Technology. I am also the founding editor of Amsterdam University Press's new book series, Horror and Gothic Media Cultures. And you can find more information in this video's description about this series, but essentially we publish books that examine the influence of technological, industrial, and socio-historical contexts on the style, form, and aesthetics of horror and Gothic genres across different media environments. This podcast episode marks the launch of our Horror and Gothic Media Cultures series, new monthly podcast and discussion group. This is open to scholars, writers, and creative practitioners from around the globe working in the area of horror and Gothic media, including graduate student scholars. And each of these podcast episodes will offer a provocation. So each one will address an element of key or current debates in horror and the Gothic. And the aim is to give you something to mull over and for us to explore further in our subsequent discussion. So each of the discussions will take place 1 to 2 weeks after each episode is released. And you can again look at the video description for details about how you can get involved in this discussion. The provocation for our first discussion group is, what's the deal with elevated horror? A question I pose in the tradition of Jerry Seinfeld style, pointing out the obvious absurdity of mundane situations type comedy. So elevated horror has plagued recent discussions about innovations in the horror genre in the 2010s and in obviously 2021 as well. And in some ways, this discussion about elevated examples of the horror genre isn't new. So the horror genre has long been derided, of course, as a low cultural genre, particularly in popular commentary. And admittedly, for fans of the genre, this is one of the subcultural appeals of horror. The horror community is fueled by this sense that we're the proverbial underdogs of film culture. However, because horror is often positioned culturally as a low genre, or similarly as a body genre, to use Linda Williams' influential terminology, a genre like pornography that traffics in the extremes of sensory and bodily affect. Because of this, discussions have cropped up periodically over the years about higher brow exceptions to the horror genre. We see this with terms like art horror, which is often used in film reviews to describe films that are deemed to have more avant-garde or highbrow leanings than the standard horror fare. It's worth noting, however, that this term art horror is used in a very different way by horror scholar Noel Carroll in his influential 1990 book, Philosophy of Horror. So in this book, Carroll uses the term art horror to describe the complex emotional responses we have to fictional monsters that defy logical understanding. We also see this tension around horror's low or highbrow status in the long-standing debates around the often flimsy distinctions between horror versus thriller films. So films like Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs are often described as thrillers rather than horror films. In the case of Silence of the Lambs, perhaps this is largely because it's a critically revered film that won the Big Five Academy Awards. In an Australian context, we have an ongoing tussle that spans both academic scholarship and popular commentary about the distinctions between the horror genre, which is associated in Australia with kind of commercial Hollywood genre filmmaking, and Ozploitation, which is Australia's distinctive twist on horror, trash, and cult filmmaking, and also the Australian Gothic, which is the term that denotes films with Gothic leanings, but kind of regionalised, Australianised Gothic leanings. But the Australian Gothic is also often, coming back to these thriller versus horror debates, simply used in a way that seems to mean a good quality horror film that is critically revered. And we saw this debate about the distinctions between horror, the Australian Gothic, and art cinema rear their head again around Jennifer Kent's 2014 masterpiece, The Babadook. So the term elevated horror is the most recent manifestation of these long-standing discussions and tensions about horror's perceived lowbrow status. The elevated horror discourse has sprung up in film criticism and popular commentary around a wave of high-budget, critically acclaimed horror films in the mid to late 2010s. The most high-profile example of these include the work of horror auteurs like Ari Aster, Jordan Peele, and Robert Eggers. And also this term is associated often with work of what we might call the indie studio auteurs like Spectavision and A24. And while this discourse has not yet made much of an impact in academic scholarship, the elevated horror moniker has been debated extensively amongst film critics and is, of course, in many ways problematic. For instance, while horror has long been considered a low genre, since the genre's cinematic inception, certain horror films have been critically revered for their artistry and intellectual depth, including The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, directed by Robert Veen and released in 1920, going all the way back to some of the origins of the horror genre, and also The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin and released in 1973, which was the first horror film to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Picture. Horror also has long-standing intersections with art and avant-garde cinema. Robert Veen's 1920 German Expressionist film is again a formative example of these links. So to describe elevated horror as a new trajectory for the genre does not really reflect or regard the genre's complex history in an accurate way. But the provocation I am posing to you in this first podcast episode for Horror and Gothic Media Cultures is there anything useful about this term, elevated horror? Does this term have any critical utility whatsoever? Or is it simply a new way for film critics who don't typically see value in horror films to demarcate those movies that they do see as valuable from the ones that they deem standard genre fare? So, elevated horror does have limited critical utility in relation to horror's rich generic history and hybridity, but the term does have widespread cultural currency at the moment. So it is perhaps worthy of some consideration. And I think the term is most interesting for the way it illuminates key elements of the current strategies of certain film distribution and production companies around the horror genre, particularly streaming services like Netflix. So-called elevated horror films span high and low genres, and as a result, they target a wider audience than films that are positioned in more straightforward ways as horror films. And elevated horror films also tend to have tonal sensibilities akin to psychological thrillers or dramas. These films also tend to refresh long-standing horror genre tropes and structures in ways that seek to garner widespread critical attention and acclaim. So reviews for elevated horror films often emphasize how these movies offer something more than the average horror movie due to their emotional depth and generic hybridity. See, for instance, my discussion of the critical reception of The Babadook, in which film critics often pointed to the film's suitability for audiences who are not typically interested in the horror genre. And the role of elevated horror in the original strategy of Netflix is particularly interesting here. From 2011 onwards, Netflix has trialed a range of strategies to use content exclusive to its platform to lure subscribers. And especially since the mid to late 2010s, high-profile, elevated, to use scare quotes, elevated horror exclusives have been an important component of Netflix's original strategy. 2021 has of course seen the release of the Netflix original Squid Game, this South Korean horror show that's become Netflix's most watched show ever. And 2021 has also seen the release of Midnight Mass, the latest series created by US horror author Mike Flanagan. And Mike Flanagan has signed a multi-year deal with Netflix, which sees him producing series exclusively for the subscription video on demand service. So Flanagan's 3 horror drama series include The Haunting of Hill House from 2018, The Haunting of Bly Manor in 2020, and of course Midnight Mass in 2021. And each of these series have received significant critical acclaim in ways that have positioned them as major works of this elevated horror wave. So in the reception of these shows, critics have defined Flanagan's Netflix outputs as distinctive from standard horror genre content. So some of the quotes from these critics include King, who suggests that these shows go beyond the ghouls and goosebumps to offer deeply felt drama. Surrey talks about how these shows combined horror with profound questions about spirituality. And Delgado writes about how these shows are more concerned with troubles of the heart than what goes bump in the night, and thus they redefine the horror genre, in Delgado's opinion. So the centrality of elevated horror to Netflix's original strategy speaks to an aim to create exclusives that have this mass audience appeal and that are likely to receive positive critical buzz. But also these types of shows are well placed to spark social media discussion and digital vernacular creativity like memes that respond to particularly shocking or frightening or tragic moments. So potently affective moments are of course common to horror, and the genre is as a result well suited to sparking what I've called in a previous journal article digital water cooler moments on social media. And both Squid Game and Midnight Mass, for instance, sparked extensive social media discussion and also digital kind of creative production like fan art across a range of digital spaces. The combination of an emotion-driven and sensorially provocative genre like horror with textual and paratextual appeals to critical esteem aligns really well with streaming services' strategies to spark multi-layered buzz around exclusive content. And of course, in creating this buzz, services like Netflix can attract new subscribers. So, thinking of elevated horror as a tool within the industry strategies of companies like Netflix might be more fruitful and useful than using the term to describe the qualities or generic identities of horror content itself. So I look forward to our first discussion group when we can sink our teeth further into this question: what's the deal with elevated horror? And I look forward to finding out whether anyone else sees any kind of usefulness, any kind of utility in this controversial term.